All right, well, here we go again. We are continuing our study from the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings. As we've discussed, it's not a book of science, it's not a book of math, it's a book of history. Genesis is the history of how man was created, how everything we see, taste, touch, and smell came into existence. The most five important words of the Bible: in the beginning God created. Because if God has not created, who could be sustaining everything? It has to be God, it has to be by His power. And so we do believe here at Winfield Baptist Church it was 6 24-hour days, it's morning and evening, and this was the blank day. And so we do believe it was 24-hour days, and we believe that God created everything in that time. We believe that He created things with age. That's an important thing to understand. He didn't create man as an infant. He had to create man and woman as adults, so they already had age when they were created. He didn't create trees as saplings. He didn't say, okay, I'll wait 20 or 30 years so they'll be full-grown trees. No, He created full-grown trees that produced seed for saplings. He didn't create eggs, He created chickens. Which came first? Chicken. Easy question to answer if you're a creationist. If you're an evolutionist, you'll say the egg. That's the difference, okay? Major difference. God started with adult plants, adult people, adult animals, and then they reproduced. And so that's important to understand as well. Okay? Now we talked about man and the fact that man was given a living soul, a spirit, by God Himself, unlike all the rest of the creation. That allowed man to make decisions. And man was free. God did not create lemmings. God created a people who He wanted to love Him back, but He had to give them the opportunity to do that. And so Adam and Eve, we know, failed. We don't know how long they were in the garden before that happened. I don't think it was long, my own personal opinion. But they failed to listen to God and obey God, so they sinned against God. They birthed 2 boys, one good, one not so good. Cain kills Abel. Cain's line is a downward spiral. There's no one godly in his line. And then there's a third son that's born, and that son was Seth. Now we've talked about the line of Seth. That's when people started to worship the Lord by name, when Seth was born. And it was Seth's generation that produced Enoch. And what was special about Enoch? He was transformed, transitioned, raptured, however you want to say it. He walked with God, and he only got the privilege of 365 years on this earth. That's all. And everybody else was living into their 900s, so maybe there was not such a good deal to live so long. But he was taken. He was the first raptured person that didn't taste death. Okay, we go down through who lived the longest. Methuselah, how long did he live? 969 years. Why didn't he live 970? Because that's when the flood came. So I love these lineages. Some people try to say there were gaps in these early lineages. That is not a coincidence that he died the year of the flood. Okay? That can't possibly be how it worked out. And so he died the year of the flood. His son Lamech died about 5 years before the flood. And Noah took us into the flood. We talked about it last week. Now, before I start, there's a reason why we teach Genesis. And why we have to teach the flood as a real experience. A guy named Dr. Wilbur Chapman, he told of a minister named Dr. Howard from Australia. He preached very strongly on the subject of sin. After the service, one of his church officers came to see him in his study. Dr. Howard, he said, "We don't want you to talk as openly as you do about man's guilt and corruption. Because if our boys and girls hear you discussing that subject, they'll be more easily become sinners. Call it a mistake, if you will, but do not speak so plainly about sin." So the minister takes down a bottle off of his shelf and he shows it to his visitors. Says, "See that label? It says strychnine. And underneath in bold red letters the word poison." He says, "Do you know, man, what you're asking me to do? You are suggesting that I change the label. Suppose I do and I paste over it the words essence of peppermint. Don't you see what might happen? Someone would use it not knowing the danger involved and would certainly die. So it is too with the matter of sin. The milder, get this, the milder you make the label, the more dangerous you make the poison." The milder you make the label, the more dangerous you make the poison. And so we can't sugarcoat sin. We can't lighten it up and say, oh, this is not so bad or that's not so bad. right? The label says poison, no matter what we put on it. And poison has results that are disastrous. That's why we talk about the fall, and that's why we talk about the ark, because sin has consequences. And this flood was a tremendous consequence to sin. And yet in the flood, we see the love of God in the grace that was shown to the righteous people of the day. That would be Noah's family. So, let's go there. Let's go see what happens now. We left him with the animals, 2 by 2, the young animals, remember. We left him with a big boat that was 450 feet long as a football field and a half. It was half as wide as a football field. It was about 5 stories tall. It had 3 inner layers, and it had an 18-inch opening all the way around just below the roof. You get that picture? Maybe you've seen it at the Creation Museum now over there in Kentucky. I haven't seen that yet. I haven't been there since they got it finished. But that's where we are. We got animals, we got food, we got everything ready, and now it's going to rain. So let's go to Genesis chapter 7. I want to read the entire chapter. It's not that long, and then we will start our discussion. Okay. The valuable words. When everything was ready, as it always is with the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the boat with all your family, for among all the people of the earth, I can see that you alone are righteous. Take with you 7 pairs, male and female, of each animal I have approved for eating and for sacrifice. And take 1 pair of each of the others. Also take 7 pairs of every kind of bird. There must be a male and a female in each pair to ensure that all life will survive on the earth after the flood. 7 days from now, I will make the rains pour down on the earth, and it will rain for 40 days and 40 nights, until I have wiped from the earth all the living things I have created." Much in that sentence. So Noah did everything as the Lord commanded him, in that one too. Noah was 600 years old when the flood covered the earth. He went on board the boat to escape the flood, he and his wife and his sons and their wives. With them were all the various kinds of animals, those approved for eating and for sacrifice, and those that were not, along with all the birds and small animals that scurry along the ground. They entered the boat in pairs, male and female, just as God had commanded Noah. After 7 days, the waters of the flood came and covered the earth. And when Noah was 600 years old, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, all the underground waters erupted from the earth, and the rain fell in mighty torrents from the sky. The rain continued to fall for 40 days and 40 nights. That very day, Noah had gone into the boat with his wife and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. With them in the boat were pairs of every kind of animal, domestic and wild, large and small, along with the birds of every kind. 2 by 2 they came into the boat, representing every living thing that breathes. A male and female of each kind entered just as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord closed the door behind them. For 40 days the flood waters grew deeper, covering the ground and lifting the boat high above the earth. As the waters rose higher and higher above the ground, the boat floated safely on the surface. Finally, the water covered even the highest mountains on earth, rising more than 22 feet above the highest peaks. All the living things on earth died: birds, domestic animals, wild animals, small animals that scurry along the ground, and all the people. Everything that breathed and lived on dry land died. God wiped out every living thing on the earth: people, livestock, small animals that scurry along the ground, and the birds of the sky. All were destroyed. The only people who survived were Noah and those with him in the boats. And the floodwaters covered the earth for 150 days. God, thank you for your word. It's truth. Guide us in your truth. Let us understand today the depth of our sin, but the depth of your grace is even greater. And so thank you for this true story about how a man could remain righteous even in the wicked days that he lived in. And God, may we walk out of this world with the same confidence. We love you and we thank you in Jesus' precious name. Amen. All right, did you catch anything interesting before I jump on into this? Anything? Because there were some interesting things said in this. Guess you'd rather I run my mouth. Okay. This is a very tough discussion. Over 1,600 years, human reproduction would have brought millions of people, maybe tens of millions or even hundreds of millions, because they lived 900 years. So for 1,600 years, yeah, there's probably a mathematical equation that would give us a number, but it will be in the millions. And if you've never thought about that, what happens to a body when it drowns? It floats. There are millions of bodies floating. These are things we don't paint when you're in children's church and Sunday school. We give you a nice little picture of a boat, people smiling, maybe Noah holding a hammer and his son holding a saw, which didn't exist back then. But we give them these really cute pictures of Noah and the ark. It's really kind of cool. It is a morbid scene. A very morbid scene. Okay? It took 7 days to cover the entire earth with water. Now, sure, the force of the underground waters erupting killed a lot of people and a lot of animals. And I want to show you what this might have looked like. Have we ever seen something like underwater pressure come from underwater? What do we call them?
Geysers.
Geysers? Anything else? From the ocean. Tsunamis. You have underwater earthquakes and you get these gargantuan 20-foot waves going miles and miles inland out of one earthquake. What would happen if you had 100 earthquakes under the ocean? Would it cover the earth with water? Let's see. Let's see. Stop and think about it. That's a good depiction of what it looked like when the earth would have opened up and would have done that. That's when you stop and think, wow. We see one, hundreds of thousands of people can be killed, right? We saw that in our lifetime. And one tsunami could kill so many people. What if the whole earth was one big tsunami? I mean, when you stop and think about it, it is morbid to think. What wasn't crushed in the first blow, what wasn't killed by the pressure, would have eventually floated to the top. And one by one, you stop and think about it. Maybe some people got a chance to get to high ground. Maybe they got to the top of their peak and that lasted until day 3. And maybe they were on a higher peak and that lasted until day 4. Maybe even higher, but by day 7 there were no high peaks. They were all gone. And when you stop and think about how intense that was, it's really kind of ugly. It's a non-children's church picture when you consider what happened. Stop and think about it. Why did God go to such extreme? Because this is an important part of the story. Why does God seem to be so cruel? Because we ask those questions today. Well, God created men and women because He's a God of love, and He wanted someone to love back. He wanted someone that would return His love, and now He looks down on the earth at this time, 1,600 years after He's created it, and His heart is broken, as we heard, because man is corrupt. Let's talk about corruption for a minute. What is corruption? Corruption is departure from the original or from what is pure and correct. This is exactly what happened to God's creation. God's creation was pure. God's creation was correct. The original was perfect the way it was supposed to be, and so was man. And yet man was corrupted by sin. Now when you move on to think, what do we have a picture of? Because it doesn't really discuss it. It doesn't say exactly. It talks about the sons of God having intercourse with the daughters of men. We covered that and covered the different possible scenarios. And it just talked about this general wickedness, right? This general idea of people sinning against God. But we get another picture in the New Testament that goes right along with it. It's called depravity. Maybe you've heard this term. Man is deprived, okay, or depraved. Depravity is the quality or state of being corrupt. There's the word. Evil or perverted. So that's the big problem. They were depraved. Where do we find this in the Bible? Anybody? Just a pop quiz. It's found in Romans chapter 1, depravity. And we actually get some details of what depravity is by the author Paul. Not all inclusive, but he does give some details. One is homosexuality is considered corrupt. It's considered outside of the original. Because he says very clearly, man with man, woman with woman is unnatural and ungodly. So that is a corruption of the original design. But he doesn't stop there. There's much more to depravity. He goes on to use words greed. Greed is depravity. Hatred, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, gossip, backstabbing, and disobeying parents. It's kind of a short list of what it looks like to be corrupt. How would you label our world today? Is it pretty corrupt?
Corrupt.
It's very corrupt. And is man depraved? Absolutely. Thankfully, God never promised never to do that again. He said He never flooded again, but He didn't say He wouldn't destroy it. So we're going to talk about that tonight. So let's talk about first the first major act of destruction that God brought upon the earth. And that's the fact it was a universal flood. We believe as a church that this flood covered the entire planet just as it says. We believe that every peak was covered. Nothing stuck out of the water. Everything was under water. We do not believe it's a myth. We don't believe it's an epic tale. We believe it's the absolute truth, and geography does prove it out, as we'll see in just a moment. Okay? Is that ready now? Let's do that. Let's do that for a second. Some of you saw this once, and I gave it to you as a tease. Now that we are in the exact part of the study, this is a great place to watch it again. Where is proof that there was a worldwide flood? How can we prove it? All right. Several of these are really good for that discussion. I want to bring you to this one because it is usually what people will point to.
Scavengers and bacteria consume them quickly. Soft tissues rarely last more than days or weeks, and hard parts like bones or shells only a month or two. But the rocks of Earth contain billions and billions of fossils, and in many places, millions of fossils are exquisitely preserved, even soft parts. How could this be? To preserve a body, it needs to be put in a safe place. Extremely cold or dry places would protect them, but most organisms don't live in those conditions. There is another solution: rapid burial. If a body is sealed from oxygen and out of reach of burrowing animals, then it has a good chance of fossilizing intact. Rapid burial is uncommon today, But there's much evidence of massive burials in the past. Not only are many fossils well preserved, they're found amidst very fine sediment layers. Fine layers rarely last in the present because all sorts of animals are digging around in the mud and soil, searching for food. In just a few weeks or months, the original layers are destroyed. But in the fossil record, churned up sediments are rare. If these sediments were laid down rapidly, however, they'd prevent burrowers from doing their job. And there are thousands of feet of such layers in the fossil record all over the world. This suggests that moving water laid down mud and sand rapidly over a wide area, and the process lasted several months. A year-long global flood, as described in the Bible, is the best explanation we know for the well-preserved fossils and fine layering throughout the rocks of the earth.
Maybe it makes a little more sense this time. Again, I showed it to you at the beginning to kind of tease you. But do fossils prove age, or do they prove something very tragic happened all at once? They prove there was a catastrophic event. There's only one way. They don't prove time. They prove that something in time happened earth-wide. Their entire planet, rocks were moved, sediment was moved, and it was all done in a catastrophic event. And so you get layer after layer after layer that was buried different levels of animals and fish, okay, and plants. The things that we find in our fossil record prove that there was a worldwide flood. Okay? That's the great explanation of it. Now, so let's move on. Let's talk about the stuff in the passage, because there's some interesting things I'm surprised you didn't catch. Did you catch the additional animals? How many animals did we learn last week were added of each type? Two. But what was said in the beginning of this passage? 7 pairs, not just 2. And why was it said in this passage? And you can cheat if you like. Say again? Sacrifice. And Phil's got actually the right answer. This is one of the areas where scholars will disagree with our New Living Translation, and I do too. Okay, the actual Hebrew, as you'll find in the ESV or the NASB or some of the word-for-word translations, maybe the one you have, says unclean and clean. Okay, most of your texts, if you don't have an NLT, say unclean and clean. They don't say food. This one says for food. Unfortunately, we know that people were vegetarians before the flood. We know, and it's proven. Okay? It's proven. If you want the references, I'll give you. You can write them in the margin and go check them out. I won't read them to you. We'll be here all night if I had all your references this evening. In Genesis 1:29, it speaks of them eating plants. In Genesis 2:16 through 17, it speaks of them giving vegetation. And then in Genesis 3:18 through 19, okay, that they ate vegetables. They ate fruits, they ate vegetables. The animals did, the people did. Nowhere does it say they ever ate meat. Okay? Nowhere. Until a future study. We'll come across it in a couple weeks. When it says, okay, now you can eat meat. And so that translation for food is not agreed upon by many people, including myself. I don't think the NLT nailed it there, and that's why there's an asterisk if you've got a study Bible in the NLT. What it says is they were clean and unclean animals, which meant, as Phil says, they're for sacrificing. They're exactly there for sacrificing. This is interesting because Moses in the law explains the split hoof and choose a cut, and if you've been reading through your Bible, you're coming across that about now, and it's like your eyes glaze over. And so he describes what's clean and unclean, but apparently Sinai was not when that instruction was given the first time. Adam and Eve knew what sacrificing meant. Their sons, Cain and Abel, knew to sacrifice. And so sacrifices started in the Garden of Eden with those first animals that God sacrificed to cover Adam and Eve's sin. From there on out, they always knew that sin required a sacrifice. And they always knew what a right sacrifice was and what a right one was not. They knew the difference between clean and unclean. And so God sent them enough clean animals to continue to sacrifice because He knew they would be on the boat for a long time. That's why they had extra animals. And remember, Noah didn't go out and pick them. He didn't go out in the field and say, I don't have one of you and a male yet. Or I don't have one of you and a female yet. He wouldn't have worked. The animals wouldn't have listened to him. God sent them. So God sent the right numbers, the right size, at the right time. Okay? So there's additional animals. The answer is, therefore, sacrifice. Because they already knew they needed to sacrifice. Now, let's talk about the wrath of God. And I didn't put times in those. So, you're going to go ahead and get it. Okay? So, the waters underground erupted. Okay? The underground waters erupted. We know I didn't put the 40 days and 40 nights. I don't think I did. I may have on your handout. Yeah, I think I did. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. Thank you, Sunday school teachers. All right? Thank you, Sunday school teachers. But then we gave the kids the false impression that they were only on the boat for a little over a month. That's a lie. Okay? They were on the boat a lot longer than that. It was not a 1 month cruise. Okay? So the Sunday school answer is 40 days and 40 nights. We heard that the underground waters erupted. Verse 11 actually paints a much darker, more violent picture than the coloring sheets in Children's Church. I like the way R. Kent Hughes, one of my commentators, describes these verses from the Hebrew text. He says, the language is evocative of a violent, churning maelstrom. The words portray a wild, water everywhere ride. The description in verse 11 describes a great rending of beds of the seas and torrential rain, and makes us recall chapter 1, when the waters above and below the firmament were separated. Now, as a mass act of decreation, they're released and unleashed back into chaos. I think that's really describing these verses. It wasn't simply a rainstorm, right? The ground opened up. It was a tremendous act of violence. Again, can imagine geysers going off everywhere, all over the planet. There's water popping off, not just from the ocean beds and the river beds, but from land. It's all this water coming out of the earth. So, now, we know that the water was 22 feet above the highest peak on earth. Yes, if Mount Everest existed back then, it was 22 feet over Mount Everest. Okay? A couple reasons for that. First, everything died. Whoops. Hey, there it was. It was actually in there. Alright, every living creature died. That meant we had to have enough water for them not to be able to stand on their tippy toes. So 22 feet, I don't know anybody that tall. There were some big people back then. The Nephilim may have been bigger than average, but they weren't 22 feet tall. And so it hit the highest peaks of 22 feet over that, and then apparently it had to be deep enough for the deep draft of the ark. I mean, the ark was 5 stories tall, so it probably drafted 20 feet when it was full. And so it had to be over 22 feet so that it didn't drag on the tops of the mountains. Simple, right? When you stop and think about it. Everything had to be covered by 22 feet of water. Now, we know that the earth was completely covered for another 150 days. Another 150 days. Sadly, we skip these verses, and the result, we get the false idea that this was a very short event. Well, it rains for 40 days, 40 nights. And then it remains under the cover of water for 150 days. Can you imagine? That's 6 months of everything on the planet completely covered by water. And that's 6 months at sea with no sign of dry land. Have you ever been on a boat and been out so far in the ocean that you can't see land? Some of you have. If you've ever been on a cruise, I did that many times in a submarine. Many times you could look anywhere you looked, and there was nothing but a horizon, nothing but water. It can be scary the first time, but then when you stop and picture who we worship and who we serve and who the Creator is, you're just like, wow, our God. Yeah, our God is a big, big God. That's how big He is. But think, that was the view that Noah had when he peered out that 18-inch window. No land in sight for 6 months. You know, even if somebody had got a hold of some driftwood or something, this would have been long enough they would not have survived. They'd run out of food, they'd run out of anything else, they would have died. Okay? So, there it is right there. That's the wrath of God. That's the price for corrupting God's creation. That's the price for depravity. And so, this was not some knee-jerk reactor from an angry deity or a last resort from some hidden God. This was 100 years of patience. 1,600 years that God waited from Adam and Eve all the way to watch to when he only had one family left and he started all over with Adam and Eve, or with Noah and his family, excuse me. So who are we all descendants of? Noah. Shem, Ham, or Japheth is our father. We're going to talk about that because we actually do know what races came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so we all know who our father is. We're ultimately the descendants of who? Adam and Eve. Right? That's a guarantee. Every living creature, as we learned from Acts, is a descendant of Adam and Eve. But we come through the line of Noah. And we'll discuss it.
There were a lot of babies, a lot of kids that had the men.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't save those children.
Yeah.
He didn't save that line of the evil.
Mm-hmm.
He
Exactly.
got away with it all.
Yeah. God won. I mean, you saw those pictures in that video. I thought that was fairly impressive. Everybody was just having a casual day. Yeah, man.
Since living creatures, does that include everything in the ocean?
No.
No.
No. Remember, he just took everything that breathed. Right? Every breathing thing. And then I get there. Every living creature died. Yeah. Yeah, every living thing on the planet died that wasn't inside the ark. Now, the fish, I would assume, again, there's a lot of fossils of fish. So the churning of the waters in the ocean would have definitely killed a very large percentage of them. I've actually seen, and this is impressive, I've seen the fossil of a whale giving birth. You got to stop and think about that. How quickly did this happen if it fossilized a whale giving in the act of giving birth? It had to be that fast. Because how quickly would she have given birth? In seconds. And so this catastrophic event happened so fast that it fossilized a whale and her soon-to-be infant whale. And so again, there are some neat fossils. There's some neat fossils of fish in mountain ranges. When you start getting into the fossil discussion, how did a fish get on top of a mountain? Because the water was up there. And so when you stop and think about it, the evidence is there. But thanks for the question. I didn't mention that, Mike. Everything that flew died because it had nowhere to land. Everything that breathed died except for those that were inside the ark. And they had all the birds there with them too. That would have driven my wife crazy. She would not have made 6 months on that ark, much less a year. I'd have had to give her a little skipper boat behind us for a while to get her sanity back. She doesn't like birds. All right. So there you go. That's the wrath of God. And that's why it's important to study it. Because this is what we learned from the flood. God will separate the righteous from the wicked. God will separate the righteous from the wicked. He did it at the flood. When will He do it again? When He returns. He spoke of it regularly. Our Savior did. He said, we'll separate the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats. There is coming a day of great separation. And God in His patience is waiting until everything is complete. And thankfully He's given us an ark, Jesus Christ, to make sure that we are of the righteous. Okay? Beth, can we have our closing song, please?